Finn, a man in his 60s with dark skin, stepped into the bank carrying a faded old bag. His clothes were worn and frayed, showing signs of a tough life. As soon as he entered, people turned to look at him. Some whispered, while others covered their noses and hurried away as if he carried a bad smell. Finn ignored them and kept walking. His goal today was simple. He needed to withdraw money to fix his broken house, and he didn't want to bother his son for help. He walked steadily to the counter, handed over his documents, and waited patiently. The bank clerk, a young woman named Clara, glanced at Finn's information on the computer. Her cheerful expression quickly turned into a frown. "You've received a large sum of money from an unknown source," she said sharply, narrowing her eyes at him. "Did you scam someone to get this, you filthy old man?" Her voice was loud enough for others in the bank to hear, drawing attention to Finn. Finn's heart sank, but he stayed calm. "You're mistaken. I don't know anything about that money," he said, trying to explain. Clara wasn't convinced. Her suspicion grew stronger, and her words became harsher. "There's no way this money is yours," she snapped, glaring at him. The crowd around them began to whisper. Some people threw him disgusted looks, while others laughed quietly. "That dirty man must be a thief," someone murmured. "Maybe he dug the money out of the trash," another added with a sneer. Finn clenched his fists tightly, feeling the weight of their insults. Despite his attempts to explain, Claire wouldn't listen. Her mind was made up. She grabbed the phone and called the police. "We need help," she said firmly. "There's a filthy black man here trying to launder stolen money." Finn stood there helplessly, his innocence ignored as the sound of sirens filled the air. Kai, Finn's son, was nearly 40 years old and still single. When he heard about his father's arrest, his chest tightened with worry. Finn had always been proud and independent, never asking for help, but now he was in trouble. Kai rushed to the police station, hoping to see his father and figure out how to bring him home. The station. The officers didn't even try to hide their disdain. One of them smirked and said, "You're wasting your time. That old man's staying here." Kai's anger flared, but he kept his voice steady. "I need to see my father," he said firmly. The officer laughed cruelly. "Stop dirtying this place. Go home and wait for his ashes. That man won't leave prison alive." Kai refused to give up. He knew his father was innocent, and he couldn't stand the thought of him suffering alone. Day after day, he returned to the station with a lawyer, pushing for answers. But the system was stacked against them, and the police made it clear they weren't going to help. Kai sat alone in his small apartment, his mind racing. The police weren't helping, and the lawyer was getting nowhere. He thought back to his old life, a time when he was a feared gangster who could handle any problem himself. Years ago, he had left that world behind, hoping to live honestly. But now, with his father's life at stake, Kai realized he might have no choice but to return to the streets. The situation became even more complicated when Kai remembered Police Chief Marcus, a man with a long history of hate. 10 years ago, Marcus had been just a regular officer, and he had arrested Kai for theft. Now, Marcus was in charge, and he seemed determined to keep Finn locked up. Like father, like son, Marcus sneered when he saw Kai. One criminal raising another. Kai clenched his fists. He hated the idea of going back to the underworld, but he couldn't sit by while his father suffered. With no other options, Kai made a decision. He called an old friend from his gang days, hoping to find out where the mysterious money in Finn's account had come from. Kai's calls to his old gang friends didn't yield much at first. Most of them claimed they didn't know anything about the money in Finn's account. But when Kai reached out to Tate, an old ally, the tone changed. Tate sounded nervous. "Stop digging, Kai," he said in a hushed voice. "You're gonna get yourself into trouble." Kai wasn't about to back down. "Tate, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. I need answers. You owe me, and now's the time to pay me back." Reluctantly, Tate gave in. The next day, he handed Kai a thick file stuffed with details. "This is everything I've got," Tate whispered. "But listen, the people behind this are dangerous. Don't go alone." Kai didn't care about the danger. As he flipped through the file, anger bubbled inside him. The trail led to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. That's where he'd find the people responsible. When Kai arrived, he saw a high-tech scam operation in full swing. Inside the warehouse, 6 pale, frail-looking men sat hunched over computers. They were too focused to notice Kai sneaking in. His instincts from his past life as a gangster kicked in. He quickly overpowered them one by one, tying them up before they could call for help. When the last man was restrained, Kai zeroed in on the manager. Pinning a gun to the man's head, Kai growled, "Talk. Who's behind this?" The manager's voice trembled as he confessed everything. They had been running a sophisticated scam, stealing money from wealthy white victims and funneling it into the accounts of random black people like Finn. The victims faced accusations of money laundering while the gang kept a hefty share of the stolen cash. Kai's grip tightened on the gun as the manager continued to spill the truth. "Why target innocent black people?" Kai demanded. The manager hesitated before answering, his voice dripping with contempt. Because it's easy. No one believes them. No one helps them. You're all powerless. Our leader. Well, he's been holding a grudge ever since some black kid stole his food when he was young. He's never let it go. Kai's anger boiled over. He pressed the gun harder against the man's head. Enough. Call your boss right now. Tell him to come here and unlock whatever needs his attention. If he suspects anything, you'll be the first to regret it. Terrified, the manager made the call. Kai stayed hidden, his instincts sharp, waiting for this mysterious leader to arrive. When the man finally stepped into the warehouse, Kai's eyes widened in shock. It was Marcus, the police chief. A T first. Kay thought Marcus was there to bust the operation, but his casual demeanor said otherwise. Marcus walked in like he owned the place, completely unaware of the trap waiting for him. As he moved toward the document safe, Kai stepped out of the shadows. Marcus froze, his hand hovering near his gun. "You don't want to do this," he said with a cold smile, but Kai wasn't interested in words. The fight began before either man could think. Years of street life had made Kai strong, but Marcus was equally tough, having clawed his way to power. The fight was brutal, each man pushing past exhaustion, trading blows that left them both bleeding. Just when it seemed neither would back down, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The sound of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the tension in the warehouse. Marcus, desperate to turn the situation in his favor, lunged at Kai with all his strength. "Stay down," Marcus growled, trying to pin Kai to the ground. But Kai wasn't about to give up. Not after everything he'd fought for. The police stormed in just as the fight reached its peak. At first, Marcus barked orders at the officers, pretending to be in control. "Arrest this man," he shouted, pointing at Kai. But the officers didn't move. One of them held up a phone, showing a recording of Marcus's double life. Kai smirked, wiping blood from his face. "You didn't think I'd come unprepared, did you?" It turned out Tate had called the police and handed over the evidence Kai had gathered, including a recording of Marcus's involvement in the scam. The officers turned to Marcus, their faces filled with disgust. His web of lies unraveled in an instant. The truth came out. Marcus had used his position as police chief to cover up his crimes, stealing money and framing innocent people. He had even dreamed of using his stolen fortune to run for mayor and eventually president, all while crushing black communities. With Marcus in handcuffs, the corrupt empire he had built began to crumble. Kai's father, Finn, was released from jail, his name cleared of all accusations. When Finn walked out of the station, Kai was waiting for him. The two embraced tightly, the weight of their struggle finally lifting. Justice had prevailed. Marcus received a life sentence for his crimes, and Finn returned home to a life of peace. Though the scars of the battle remained, Kai knew he had done the right thing. For once, the system had been forced to face the truth, and good had triumphed over evil. Kai and Finn sat together on the old wooden porch of their home, the sunlight warming their faces. It had been a long, painful journey, but now they could finally breathe again. Finn looked at his son, his voice soft but full of emotion. "You didn't have to go through all that for me," he said. Kai shook his head. "I couldn't let them destroy you, Dad. You've spent your whole life working hard, doing the right thing. It's time someone stood up for you." Finn smiled, his weathered face showing both pride and relief. For the first time in weeks, he felt like the storm had passed. News of Marcus's downfall spread quickly, shocking the entire community. The once respected police chief, who had used his power to oppress others, was now a disgraced criminal. People couldn't believe the extent of his corruption. His carefully crafted image as a leader had been nothing more than a mask hiding his greed and hatred. Despite the victory, Kai couldn't ignore the scars the battle had left behind. He thought about the risks he had taken and the old life he'd been forced to revisit. But as he looked at his father, safe and free, he knew it had been worth it. Finn placed a hand on Kai's shoulder. "You've always been stronger than you realize," he said. "This world isn't fair, but you prove that even when the odds are against us, we can fight back and win." Kai nodded, determination shining in his eyes. The battle had changed him, but it had also reminded him of his purpose. No matter how tough life got, he would always fight for justice, not just for his father, but for anyone who couldn't fight for themselves. As they sat in peaceful silence, the weight of the past began to lift. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for now, they had something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope.